Hello everyone, welcome back for more human physiology. So it is time to start our next chapter. So chapter 4 is all going to be focusing on tissue. So this is kind of a natural progression of things because you will notice that chapter 2 was all about atoms and molecules, chapter 3 was all about cells, and now chapter 4 is going to be all about tissue. And the good news is, after chapter 4, we can start focusing in on particular organs and organ systems. But before we get there, let's focus on the task at hand. So this first video is going to be very much on the short side. We're just going to introduce the concept of cells and tissues working together. So let's get after it. So the sort of thing that we're going to get familiar with in this chapter is, as I said, we can appreciate tissues and the cells that make them up. So we're going to get familiar with the types of cells that you're going to find in particular types of tissues. So we've mentioned before that there's approximately 200 different types of cells in the body, but the good news is there's not nearly that many different types of tissues. So we're not going to have a whole lot that we're tasked with remembering here. So dating back to our discussion on levels of organization in the human body, this picture here might look a little bit familiar. So if we date back to the previous chapter, which was all about cell biology, you'll recall that a bunch of cells that work together make up a tissue. So the other way that we can kind of say that is that cells that get grouped together in a particular tissue actually are going to have a very similar developmental lineage in terms of their stem cell origin. A perfect example of this is the blood. So blood is a particular type of connective tissue, and all the cells that are found within blood are going to be red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. And as we discussed at the end of chapter 3, when we talked about hematopoiesis, those are all cells that belong to the same multipotent lineage. So the different types of cells that make up a tissue are generally speaking, not always, but generally going to be very similar in terms of their structure and to a certain extent function. So it's going to take all different types of cells to really make a functional tissue, but generally speaking, all those cells are going to kind of look alike and function alike. I mentioned that there are well over 200 different types of cells in the body, but thankfully there are only really 4 different types of tissues. So those 200 different types of cells we can kind of place into these 4 different categories. The first is called nervous tissue. So the major feature of nervous tissue is that a certain type of cell that we're going to see in nervous tissue is excitable, meaning that it is capable of allowing for the transmission of electrical information. This is going to be important because this will allow us to talk in further detail about the input and output signals that we introduced in chapter 1. Muscle tissue is also excitable. Muscle tissue doesn't actually send electrical information, but it is capable of responding to electrical stimulation that comes from nervous tissue. So muscle tissue can respond to this electrical stimulation to produce contractile and mechanical force, as we are familiar with. Epithelial tissue is completely different. So epithelial tissue is not excitable. Basically, it exists to organize cells into sheets of protective layers to allow us to either protect or segregate different structures into compartments, as we have discussed before. And certain types of epithelial tissue will also allow for transport processes to occur. If you will recall, in chapter 3, we talked about the intestinal absorption of glucose. Well, those transport processes were occurring across a single layer of epithelial tissue. And finally, the most diverse group of tissue is called connective tissue. So the cells within connective tissue have many different types of function depending on what type of connective tissue that you're talking about. But generally speaking, we're going to be talking about forming connections, giving support, providing resilience, or anchoring different tissues or cells in place to give them structural integrity. So in this picture, you can actually see a schematic of many different structures and organ systems in the body, and we can get kind of a general appreciation for where the 4 different types of tissues tend to be found. Nervous tissue, of course, is mainly going to be found in the brain and the spinal cord, as well as nerves that make connections throughout the body. Epithelial tissue will be located in places that segregate body structures into compartments. So we're talking about places like the skin, the digestive tract, the respiratory tract, and so on. Muscle tissue will be located in quite a few different places other than the places that you might think. Of course, you're going to find certain types of muscles attached to the skeleton. Certain types of muscles, of course, make up the structural component of the heart. And then other types of muscles will allow for certain types of homeostatic mechanisms to occur all throughout the body. And we'll talk about that when we get to our video on muscle tissue. And then connective tissue is going to be found all over the place. So we're talking about things like bone and fat and structural connections like cartilage and tendons and ligaments. And then connective tissue really is found all over the place. So we don't want to necessarily pigeonhole it into being located in one specific place. So that is going to do it for this introductory video. Join us next time and we will start talking about each of the 4 types of tissue one by one. Our next video will be on the nervous tissue, so I will go ahead and sign off and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.